Now the stage is set for the 15th edition of the crucial BRICS Economic Summit, and leaders representing almost half of the world's population have made their way to South Africa's Johannesburg. A central focus of the summit will be the possible expansion of the bloc. The second pivotal discussion will revolve around the bloc's de-dollarization bid. Meanwhile, palpable suspense over the much-anticipated bilateral meeting between India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and Chinese President Xi Jinping continues to intensify. Now, China and Russia have expressed interest in expanding the group in an effort to grant it greater weight in international affairs. Additionally, over 40 countries have expressed interest in joining the bloc, and 22 have been formally requested membership. Meanwhile, there are differing views on expansion among the existing members of the bloc. India has historically been worried about the idea of expansion. It is apprehensive that an expansion would be used by China to increase its influence within BRICS. On the other hand, de-dollarization has taken on fresh importance for Russia and China. This as they have increasingly come under sanctions from the West. And while South Africa, Brazil and India have better relations with the West, they too see lesser reliance on the dollar as being a positive for their economic growth and also trade potential. The BRICS track record on de-dollarization has been mixed. Even though China and Russia have successfully reduced their dependence on the dollar for cross-border trade, the new development bank established by BRICS in large part to facilitate the de-dollarization of state lending is largely dependent on the dollar. Let's now shift our focus to the much anticipated question around this year's summit. Will there be a bilateral between India's Prime Minister Modi and China's President Xi? The India-China border standoff has impacted bilateral ties with minimal diplomatic engagement between the two countries over the last 3 years. Following his meeting with India's National Security Advisor Ajit Doval last month, Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi spoke of the two leaders having reached a consensus to restore bilateral ties. Separately, Prime Minister Modi and Premier Xi also discussed bilateral ties in their Bali meeting last month. And the Johannesburg meeting, of course, however, comes days after the Chinese reportedly having refused to budge on Ladakh in the 19th meeting of senior military commanders this month. Now, for more on this much-anticipated BRICS Summit 2023, we are being joined by Brahmachalani from New Delhi. He is a professor of strategic studies at the Center for Policy Research. And also, we are being joined by my colleague, Alison Lagrange from South Africa, of course. Alison, let's start with you. Just moments from now, Prime Minister Modi is going to is going to address the Indian diaspora in South Africa, of course. How is the mood on the ground and what are you hearing from the diaspora?
Yes, Ananya, you're right. Any minute now, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is expected to arrive here. We are at the Sandton Sun Hotel in Johannesburg, South Africa. We've been interacting with the guests, the members of the Indian diaspora who have come from all over the country. They have come from neighboring countries and all around the world just to see Prime Minister Modi here in South Africa. The overarching feeling is extremely positive. Some of the people that we spoke to have expressed their hopes for a stronger future between South Africa and India. They have expressed hope in terms of agricultural growth and development, even saying that perhaps in the future South Africa can, with India's help, feed the world. Now, there is a lot of sense of potential growth between the two countries. People here have come in their dressed in their best, in their traditional Indian attire, and very excited to listen to Prime Minister Modi speak.
Of course, the excitement is palpable indeed. And Mr. Chelani, before departing for South Africa, Prime Minister Narendra Modi said that the summit will provide a useful opportunity for its members to identify future areas of cooperation. I want to ask you, what's in it for India in this cooperation?
Well, the BRICS is a major non-Western forum. It is trying to become a credible alternative to Western-dominated institutions like the G7. Even the G20 that India will be hosting in 17 days from now is largely dominated by the Western bloc. So BRICS, as the voice of the Global South, is part and parcel of India's outreach to the Global South. The question, though, is whether the BRICS can unify as a bloc to become a cohesive initiative in international relations. The fact is that thus far, BRICS has failed to adopt common positions on pressing international issues. BRICS has failed even to come up with common positions on the reforms it wants in international institutional structure. For example, in the Bretton Woods system, what reforms it wants in the IMF and the World Bank, for example, there are no common positions. Now, unless the BRICS states develop common positions, BRICS will remain an acronym in search of a common identity and a common agenda.
Right, now coming to common consensus is why the summit is happening, and of course you rightly point out, so we are yet to see if that consensus is attained at least in this year's summit. But Mr. Chelani, there is no clarity over Prime Minister Narendra Modi and President Xi Jinping's meeting. But I want to ask you still, in case it happens, do you see any immediate change on the ground, so to say, the LAC?
Well, first, the South African president has invited 67 leaders from outside the BRICS bloc, leaders from Latin America, Africa, and Asia, to the BRICS summit. So Prime Minister Modi will be having a number of bilateral meetings. A possible meeting with Xi Jinping will be only one such meeting if it were to happen. But certainly Mr. Modi is going to meet with, for example, with Sheikh Hasina, the Prime Minister of Bangladesh, is also having a bilateral with Iran and a number of other countries. The issue with China is that we have a situation along the Himalayan frontier that is largely created by China's border aggression of April 2020. And China has refused to roll back its land grabs in Eastern Ladakh. What we have achieved so far, despite being involved in negotiations for 3 years now, is that buffer zones have been created in 4 areas in Eastern Ladakh, and these buffer zones have come up largely on Indian territory. Currently, the two sides are negotiating confidence-building measures. The concern is that these CBMs will further sanctify the revised line of actual control that China has sought to impose on India through its border aggression. Now, whether the bilateral meeting with Xi Jinping happens in Johannesburg or it happens in New Delhi, when Xi Jinping comes to New Delhi in 17 or 16 days from now, irrespective of where it happens, there will be a bilateral between Modi and Xi Jinping. The issue that we need to discuss is whether China will be willing to be somewhat flexible, because Xi Jinping has adopted a very hardline position towards India. Right. He has refused to climb down. And unless he climbs down to some extent, there can be no deal that can actually truly defuse the border crisis.